Okay, we are in 1 Samuel chapter 21 this morning, and if you'll open your Bibles there, that's where we will pick up. I'm hoping to get through chapter 22, but we'll see how well that works out. And as you can see, I put up here on the whiteboard kind of an outline of the next major section that we're going to be going through. This outline isn't original to me. I found it in a book and I played with it a little bit, but basically what we have is a series of events that are kind of parallel to each other. It begins with David fleeing and Saul killing the priests, and it ends with Saul being killed at Gilboa. Now there's a whole sequence there that makes me think that Saul being killed is in some ways a retribution for the fact that he killed the priests in chapter 22. God visits his judgment on Saul finally for at least partly that reason. In the B sections, chapter 23 and chapter 27, you have David saving the city, the Judean city of Keilah from the Philistines. And then later you have David protecting Judean cities while he claims to be protecting the Philistines. Chapter 27 is kind of an interesting little thing where David claims to be working for the Philistines and attacking Israelite towns, but really he's attacking other towns and killing everybody so that they can't report back to the Philistines what's going on. Chapter 23 and 24 and 26, you have these parallel incidents where the Ziphites betray David's location. Saul goes out to hunt for David, and David has an opportunity to kill Saul, but he doesn't take it. That happens twice, and of course they surround the central part of the narrative, which in many ways I believe is one of the most important stories in Samuel, his encounter with Nabal and his wife Abigail. But we'll talk about all that in due course when we get to it. David is wandering in the wilderness, and I made mention of this a little bit last time, but the word for wilderness actually finds its greatest concentration in these 11 chapters right here. There's several wilderness locations throughout that are important in David's life. It was, of course, the place in 1728 where David was shepherding the sheep, but the wilderness, of course, is where David spends the bulk of the remainder of 1 Samuel. And whenever we think of wilderness, who do we usually think of? We usually think of the Israelites in the wilderness and their period of testing that they went through. And there's just as Israel, God's firstborn son from Exodus 4:22, was tested in the wilderness, so also David, who later receives the promise of sonship, that I will be a father to him and he will be a son to me, so David will also be tested in the wilderness. And sometimes David will pass that test, like when he encounters Saul. Sometimes David, I don't think, does so well in the wilderness, and we'll be looking at that as we go as well. I want to note one other thing. The parallels between the beginning and the ending sections need a little more comment. Both of these sections deal with chapters 21 and 22 deal with the beginning of David's fugitive life from Saul, and while chapters 28 through 31 deal with the end of that time. Both sections depict David inquiring of God in chapter 22 and verse 15, and in chapter 30 in verses 7 and 8. The first section involves Saul killing the priests, which that's normally where you go to inquire of God. The second section begins with Saul trying to inquire of the priests, or inquire of God, and God doesn't answer. Well, no wonder, Saul, you killed everybody you could possibly inquire by. There's also both sections involve eating bread. David eats at the table of the priests, while Saul eats at the table of the witch of Endor. And both sections involve David being dismissed from the presence of the Philistine king Achish in chapters 21 and 29. There's that quote from the famous song in both sections, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And the Philistines say, we can't have David here, he's going to try to oppress us. And so David gets himself removed from the Philistine court. So all that, just to kind of note, the Bible, this isn't just a bunch of isolated incidents. This is one story, and it does connect together, and it intentionally echoes itself sometimes. Let's start with David visiting the priests of Nob in chapter 21. Can I get somebody to read the first 9 verses of chapter 21?
David came to Nob to assemble the priests. Amalek was afraid when that day said to him, "Why are you alone?" David said to Amalek the priest, "The king has ordered me on business, and said to me, do not let anyone know anything about the business what I have commanded you, and I have directed my young men to place. Now therefore, what have you on hand? 5 the young man have David answered, truly women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out. And the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in effect common, even though it is consecrated to the vessels of the day. So the priest gave him holy bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread. Ordered to put hot bread in its place till the day was taken away. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day to thank the Lord. His name was Doeg, and he was the herdman who belonged to Saul. David said to Ahimelech, "They're not here on hand to your sword, for I brought neither my sword or my weapon to be with me, because our hand." So the priest said, "The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, is killed in the valley of Elah. There it is, wrapped in the cloth behind you. If you will, take that. No other except that one here." David said, "There is none like it. Give it."
All right. Ahimelech comes out to greet David, not to be confused with Abimelech. The name sounds so familiar, but Ahimelech comes out to greet David and asks him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" Oh, is David all by himself, all lonesome? Nobody's with him at all?
Well, he's told his young man, where else would they hide?
Well, yeah. I mean, then we...
Approaching them, but other people.
There's other people available, yeah. There's a mention in the Gospels also of how David and his companions were present on this occasion. And verse 5 seems to assume that there's other people with David. So why does Ahimelech say, "Why are you by yourself then?" Did you bring the king with? Okay, yeah. So there's kind of an expectation, if you will, that David's going to be with Saul. I mean, because David normally goes with Saul's. He's normally commanding Saul's army. He's normally leading that whole entourage, and David would be expected to travel in Saul's procession since he goes in and comes out before the people. And here David is, maybe with a few people with him, but it's still very unusual. It's not expected that he would appear. Someone would appear with him. And of course, we can talk this way in English too. I mean, if a friend. Someone drives me to a potluck and my wife has to stay home sick, and somebody asks me, "So are you here by yourself?" Yeah, even though a friend drove me to the potluck. I can still answer that question that way because the people I would normally be with are not with me. So in that sense, yes, you are here by yourself. You are alone. Now, Ahimelech, I don't know about you, Ahimelech seems nervous here. He comes out trembling to meet David. Why would he be nervous? In verse 1. Why is he trembling? He doesn't like conflict? What makes him think this is going to be a conflict? Maybe. He may know something is wrong. He doesn't seem to know the specifics. Because, you get to chapter 22, and Ahimelech basically claims, "I didn't know anything was up." He says, as far as I knew, you and David were on good terms. Why are you coming after me? It's the idea in chapter 22. Ahimelech's nervousness is, of course, proven justifiable because Saul has him and his household killed. There is an interesting echo in chapter 16 in verse 4 when Samuel goes out to anoint David. The elders of Bethlehem come out trembling. It's the same word. It's kind of this question, well, where's Saul? He's normally with you, Samuel. Well, Samuel's come to do something quite different from what Saul wants. And the same thing is going on here with Ahimelech. And David explains, "The king has sent me on a secret mission." Of course, once again, this is kind of like chapter 20. David's engaging in a little bit of deceit to get what he wants here. In one sense, of course, he's lying. I think there's another sense in which, of course, what he says is unwittingly true because Saul has sent him away by being rather cruel and violent towards him, and David hasn't been able to tell anyone why. So, yes, the king has sent me away secretly. But, of course, we also know that David's not being entirely truthful with Ahimelech. How do we evaluate that? What do we think of that?
Oftentimes, God
That's true.
And this is the story.
Yeah. And there is kind of there is kind of a question lingering in the background of why go to Nob at all. He needs food and weapons, he claims. But of course, because he's not entirely forthright, what winds up happening? Yeah, the priests at Nob all die. And David actually blames himself for that later in chapter 22 and verse 22. He says, I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, I have brought about the death of every person in your father's household. David seems to kind of blame himself there a little bit for what happens at Nob. He realizes, maybe he made some missteps on that particular occasion. All right, but David requests food for provision. And the priest informs him that there's no food available except the holy bread. Well, of course, David and his men are not allowed to eat this bread unless they have kept themselves from women. Why that particular prohibition? Yeah, well... Yeah. Well, Leviticus chapter 24 and verse 9 gives the law of the consecrated bread. Leviticus 24 in verse 9... it's a whole list of things. But I'll start reading in verse 5. You shall take fine flour and bake 12 cakes with it. 2/10 of an ephah shall be in each cake. You shall set them in 2 rows, 6 to a row, on the pure gold table before the Lord. You shall put pure frankincense on each row, that it may be a memorial portion for the bread, even an offering by fire to the Lord. Every Sabbath day he shall set it in order before the Lord continually. It is an everlasting covenant for the sons of Israel. It shall be for Aaron and his sons, and they shall eat it in a holy place, for it is most holy to him from the Lord's offerings by fire, his portion forever. The consecrated bread was for Aaron and his sons, his descendants, the priests, in other words. It's similar to Leviticus 6. All of the grain offering portions are for the priests. And Jesus actually affirms that it was unlawful for David to eat this bread in all 3 gospel accounts where he mentions this story. We'll look at Jesus' words in a second. The priest makes this concession, though, that they can eat the bread only if they've kept themselves from women. Why that particular concession? I think that was going to be a catch. That's an interesting question. I think that the priest is at least trying to be conscious of the ritual laws here. Having a man, even when a man has sex with his wife, it rendered him ceremonially unclean, according to Leviticus chapter 15 and verse 18. You could not be with a woman and go into the tabernacle on the same day, because it rendered you unclean for a day ceremonially. That doesn't mean it was sinful. It just means that you couldn't go into the presence of God in that unclean state. Now Jesus. What David did lawful here? Well, I think from reading Leviticus we can be indicated that what he did wasn't exactly within the scope of the ritual laws. Now, some people interpret this to mean that David's demonstrating a lack of faith. He takes the bread. I think we need to look at what Jesus said again. In Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through 28. I'll read Mark's account. It happened that he was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. The Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need? He and his companions became hungry. How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests. And he also gave it to those who were with them." Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Now, what are we to make of that comparison? I know that Jesus is using the David story to explain what his disciples do on the Sabbath. Let's reason backwards, maybe. How do we use what happens here to understand the David story? Okay.
God created man, litigate man, law, thou shalt not eat of the garden. He didn't set that before he created man. So the law is there to serve man's good. In case of extreme need, which David apparently was in, Jesus either Jesus is excusing David's actions here, or he's exposing the hypocrisy of the scribes and Pharisees who excuse David's actions here. I'm not sure which it is.
Yeah, that's the tough interpretive question that a lot of people wrestle with.
Jesus is saying to them here, if a man is Lord of the Sabbath, which the scribes and Pharisees at least are saying here that David was Lord of the Sabbath because he was able to violate the law of the showbread, how much more would the Son of Man be?
Yeah, I think those are some important things. I mean, well, even more important than that, picking heads of grain isn't unlawful unless you're reading the oral law and the traditions, the Mishnaic traditions that were going around. In every gospel that this appears in, it's interesting. Every gospel that story appears in, it always follows the discussion on fasting. First, the Pharisees criticize the disciples for not fasting, and then they criticize the disciples for eating on the Sabbath. And now, David's situation is similar to the disciples, of course. It's easy to see the parallel. They're both hungry. And the only bread available is the consecrated bread, and that bread's only allowed to be eaten by the priest. And so, in the strictest sense, David did not follow the law in Leviticus. And in the strictest sense, what he did was unlawful. And yet the Pharisees would concede, I think, that what David did on that occasion was necessary because of hunger. In essence, it becomes an argument from the greater to the lesser. If the Pharisees let David break the law for hunger, why can't the disciples break it for tradition? I saw a hand. Yes. Yes, that's a good point as well. He even later talks about, if a son falls into a well, of course you're going to dig him out, right? Kathleen, did you have something? Oh, okay, you both thought of the same thing. Great, all right. Jesus, I think there's another element here too. Man was not created to serve the Sabbath. The Sabbath was created to serve man. Even you say that the law came after man was created. The Sabbath came after man was created too. It was God created the day of rest after He created man. And the Sabbath, here's another question we have to wonder about, is what happens when two of God's laws come into a supposed conflict? For instance, someone is born and their 8th day of their life falls on the Sabbath. Do you circumcise them? Well, according to Jesus, you do. In John 7, 22 and 23, on the Sabbath, you circumcise a man so that the law will not be broken. That's okay on the Sabbath. Matthew 12:5, have you not read that the priests break the Sabbath and are innocent? Who works more than anybody else on the Sabbath? Well, the priests do. They actually have to work more on the Sabbath than they do on other days because there's double the number of sacrifices of the regular burnt offerings. In various times, Jesus heals on the Sabbath. He points out the fact that, by working on the Sabbath to heal others, He's actually fulfilling the reason the Sabbath even existed in the first place, to give rest to man. So applied to David's scenario, we might ask the same question. Was the holy bread made for man, or was man made for the holy bread? Does God need that holy bread? Is He going to starve if they take the holy bread off the table? Well, no. He makes the point, if I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you because all of the food of the earth belongs to me. The whole reason... Let me ask you a question then. Why does it matter? What is the reason for the restriction on the holy bread? Why make that law in the first place if it can just be so easily, okay, yeah, what is that significance?
It's out of respect for God.
Respect for God, making a distinction between the holy and the common, the clean and the unclean. And even if I think David does several things in this chapter I think are questionable, but, whose idea is it to eat the holy bread? Is it David's idea? And he asks for food. David says, do you have any bread? Ahimelech says, all we have is the holy bread. You can have that if you have consecrated yourself, if you have kept yourself from women. Ahimelech won't give him the bread if he's ceremonially unclean, because therein you see that preservation of the distinction between clean and unclean. Don. Or whatever can be found. And yeah, well, there's actually 12 loaves of bread on the table if they're following the law. But there's a, what do we do with that? Well, again, we have to answer the question, what happens when two laws come into supposed conflict? Well, then we do have to use our brains a little bit in judgment. And in this case, David defers to the priestly judgment, which is technically what you're supposed to do when that happens, per Deuteronomy 17:12. Ahimelech has a choice, though. He can keep the bread sacred and let David faint from hunger, or he can feed David's hunger and make the bread a little less than sacred. And so what Ahimelech does is he makes a compromise. And there's two laws here that have to be considered. On the one hand, the bread's for the priests. On the other hand, you're supposed to provide for the needy, and you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself, per Leviticus 19:18. Did Ahimelech make the right choice? It was his judgment. The text doesn't say. There's the difficulty, right? None. It does cost him his life. Well, and a number of things in this chapter lead to him being cost his life. That's true. I mean... Oh, the ends justify the means. Is that it? Okay, well, see, right here I think we have the issue. Jesus identifies eating the bread as unlawful. But in the context of Matthew's account, he also claims that we should be merciful. And he quotes from Hosea 6:6 in Matthew's account, "If you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent." The point Jesus makes ultimately is that if a priest can set aside an express command to show mercy, how much more a tradition, something that ultimately isn't a law of God and doesn't matter. That I think is a key point in all this. There's a lot more that can be said about this. Any comments or questions before we move on? I've got another thing I want to look at. Verses 7 through 9, verse 7 kind of gives us this ominous foreshadowing. Doeg the Edomite is there. Doeg is the one that rats them out to Saul in the next chapter. David requests a weapon. I think it's odd that a king would send David on a secret errand and not let him take his weapons with him, but that's what's happened. And the only weapon on hand, incidentally, is the sword of Goliath. And so, in a great twist of irony, David adopts as a weapon the weapon of the man whom he first killed in battle. Now, how do we interpret that? Yes? I wondered about... I've wondered about that too. I don't know. That's one of those questions I just have no answer to.
I don't know that he couldn't carry Saul's sword, but he was not. Now you would think that he has gotten some training.
Yeah, well, maybe. But, yeah, well, I mean, it's possible even for a five-fingered man to wield a six-fingered sword, so I don't know. It might be possible for David to wield the sword of Goliath, but there's a giant in the Bible that has 6 fingers, by the way. Let's just mention that. But we see this... I've had some people, and I don't know what I think of this, but I'm going to throw it out there for consideration. Some people interpret this as a lack of faith on David's part. He didn't need a sword to kill Goliath, but all of a sudden he needs Goliath's sword. I don't really know what I think of that approach, especially considering David actually does kill Goliath with his own sword in the first place. But I mean, does this indicate a lack of trust on David's part? Throw that out there for consideration.
I don't think so. And I don't really his weapons stuff yours was taking. Really kind of belonged to me.
Okay, all right. All right, so basically he's getting what's rightfully his, just like it took him a while to get the daughter of the king that was rightfully his. That's a thought to consider. Okay, I mean, unless anybody has any comments or questions, I want to move on and finish out the chapter. Verses 10 through 15, containing probably my favorite quote in the whole book of Samuel. Can somebody read verses 10 through 15? I mean, what do we... I think it's interesting. David takes a Philistine sword and he goes and tries to join the Philistine army. He's later actually successful at doing this in chapter 27, but this attempt fails for some reason. Achish's servants, they spot David and their reaction to his presence is what?
Spy.
This guy's a spy. You know, they cite the song, and apparently the song's gone everywhere in 18:7. Saul's slain his thousands. David is 10,000s. This is the guy who's been killing all of us. And, you know, there's a certain mistrust of David. And just like they went out of their way to try to capture Samson, you know, are we going to try to capture David? And Samson never got to the 10,000s mark. But technically David hadn't gotten to the 10,000s mark when they started singing that song either. But it's still interesting. You know, David's presence among the Philistines has become legendary. And David becomes afraid, understandably, in verse 12. And he acts insane. He foams at the mouth. He scribbles or drums or scratches on the gate, however you translate that. Does it remind us of anything? From earlier? Like just a couple chapters earlier? Sounds like Saul. Okay, yeah, it does. I mean, Saul didn't do all of the same things, but you know, Saul acted like the madman in chapter 19. The difference, of course, is David does this of his own free will because he's trying to get out of something. Saul's trying to get into some place and he's forced to behave like a madman instead. And Achish is angry and says, "Do I lack madman that you have brought this one to act the madman in my presence?" A clear sign that Achish was in fact a politician. David is expelled from Gath and escapes with his life very narrowly on that occasion. How do we interpret this story? You know, what significance does this have for David's life? Okay, you know, so does David give God credit for what happens here? Yes, you are right. Psalm 34, I know that there's disagreement about this, but I'm of the opinion we should take the psalm heading seriously. In Psalm 34 is a psalm of David when he feigned madness before Abimelech, who drove him away and he departed. Again, we have this issue with names being changed in the headings. Abimelech is probably more of a title than an actual name anyway. But in this case, it's describing the time that David feigned madness. He says, "I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul will make its boast in the Lord. The humble will hear it and rejoice." And he goes on and talks about how God delivers His servants, how He protects them, and how He takes care of them. And how we ultimately just need to cease from evil and do good. Who is the man who desires life and loves length of days that he may see good? Verse 12, "Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Depart from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. Because the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and His ears are open to their cry. But the face of the Lord is against evildoers, to cut off the memory of them from the earth." And so it's interesting that this psalm is applied to this situation. This psalm is also important in reading the book of 1 Peter as well.
Telling the story, we're not getting
No, we're not.
especially not in one place. There are many passages where, like, for example, have part of the story in the other part of the story in Chronicles.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, it helps to put details from the Bible together so that we can see things. I mean, we do this all the time, even subconsciously. I mean, we refer to a story in the New Gospels as the rich young ruler, in spite of the fact that he's only young in Matthew and he's only a ruler in Luke. We had to put some pieces together to arrive at that conclusion in the first place. I think it's helpful to look at the way other passages of the Bible interpret the narratives, especially when we're not given a lot of commentary from God in and of itself. We have a lot of places in the Old Testament where something will happen and you won't get a comment saying, "No, God said that this was bad," or "God said that this was a good thing," or there's no commentary being given as we go along the text. We're sort of left to figure it out for ourselves. It's the way that God chooses to tell the story. And, He gives explanations elsewhere, but it's still important, I think, to... I think it's important to defer to those explanations when we can, when we're reading difficult passages in the Old Testament like this. Anyhow, enough on that tangent. Chapter 22. Chapter 22, let's go ahead and read verses 1 through 5. Somebody read verses 1 through 5. Right. So David goes to Adullam, and his brothers and his family join him, and a bunch of other people join him too. In verse 2, how would you characterize these people that join him? Riffraff, misfits. Not the most savory of people, okay? Well, but let's look at them for a second. Verse 2, everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was discontented. What do we do with that? It's a revolt. Why would people be discontent? Okay. Okay, so we might take this as a sign of the decay of Saul's administration. And let me ask you something else. Is there anyone else that we read about in the future that also kind of has this way about him? Yes, there you go. Yes, and I think that what we're seeing here is ultimately mirrored in Jesus. Jesus, who ate with the misfits of society, who spent time with tax collectors and sinners. He had all the people coming to him who were in distress, people who were sick, people who were afflicted with every kind of disease. And you know what Jesus did? He healed them. He made disciples out of them. Hopefully, that's the. David starts gathering a crowd around himself, much in the same way that we see Jesus doing later. So what he's doing here, in many ways, foreshadows Jesus, I think. This masses in distress gathering around David help foreshadow another king around whom the masses surround, looking for an answer to their distress. And then he sends his family to Moab. Philistia is off in the west of Israel. Moab's off east of Israel, across the Jordan. Why would he send his family to Moab, of all places? They're friendly. Not like he knows anybody in Moab, right? There you go. Yes. Ruth got it. She was a descendant of Ruth, the Moabitess. So he does have family in Moab, distant relatives by this point. But still, he's the great-grandchild of a woman from the land of Moab. So, this is an option for him. Now, David sends his family to Moab, but David doesn't stay in Moab himself. The prophet Gad informs him that he should not stay in the stronghold. He needs to go back to Judah. And so David finally gets that inquiry of God that he has been waiting for in verse 3. He says, "Let my father and mother come stay with you until I know what God will do for me," in verse 3. And in verse 5, he he gets that inquiry of God from the prophet Gad. Gad is later the prophet who has to rebuke David for his sin of numbering the people in 2 Samuel 24. He's actually referred to as David's seer. I guess, we think of Nathan as normally associated with David, but there was also the prophet Gad who was in his court at that time as well. Anything down to verse 5? That is a good question. I don't know. I get the impression, chapter 30 indicates that David was sending spoils to his family it says he was sending spoil to his friends in Judah. It doesn't mention his family. There's also an indication that David had taken over the Philistine town of Ziklag and kind of put a lot of family members there. I don't know if that would include his Bethlehemite family or not. I don't know. But it's clear he probably moves them to get them away from Saul, because if Saul's trying to kill David, it's only a matter of time before Saul goes after his family. Saul doesn't seem to have much of a hard time going after his own family members. And in this case, we see that Saul doesn't have a hard time going after the priests of Nob either. I don't think we have time to cover verses 6 through 23 in the detail that they deserve, so I'm going to go ahead and put that off for next time, and we'll pick up and try to get through that and into hopefully through chapter 23 as well next time. So keep reading, and if anybody's got anything before we close, we'll call it a class.